أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Respected brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we thank and praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has afforded us the opportunity to be in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to learn from the glorious Quran. And as our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam teaches us, whomsoever sits in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, waiting from one waqt to the next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will record as if that person had been in the entire time he had been in ibadah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to record us of those who are constantly in ibadah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We send salutations upon our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the glorious Quran, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. Alhamdulillah, last week we spoke about Prophet Ayyub alayhi salatu wasalam. We spoke about Dhul Kifl, who is one of those prophets whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mention much about. And we've started a little bit, we've touched a little bit on the life of Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the glorious Quran in regards to Nabi Yunus, وَإِنَّ يُونُسَ لَمِنَ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. Indeed, Yunus was one of our messengers, alayhi salam. Says our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in a hadith as recorded by Abdullah ibn Abbas, where Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, don't grant me any fadl above even that of Yunus bin Matta. Where Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says that Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam, don't think that Nabi Yunus was better than me. And we know this was out of the fadl and the grace of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He was a very humble being. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam never thought of himself as being high level or being someone of status, being anyone better than anyone else. And therefore when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam speaks about the Anbiya alayhi salatu wasalam, he speaks of them as these ikhwan, as his brothers, and his aba, and his ascendants, his fathers. All of them, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and many of the prophets being descendant of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't ever think of himself as being better than anyone. One of the obscure prophets, one of the prophets that's not mentioned so much about, we know only one incident out of his whole life, was Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam. So Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam does not even want to say that there's any preference of himself over Nabi Yunus, even though we know only one story of his alayhi salatu wasalam. This is just to show us how humble Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is. Now in regards to Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam, says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَإِنَّ يُونُسَ لَمِنَ الْمُرْسَلِينَ إِذْ أَبَقَى إِلَى الْفُلْكِ الْمَشْخُونِ. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he ran to the ship and he had agreed to cast lots. فَسَاهَمَ فَكَانَ مِنَ الْمُحْتَضِينَ فَانْتَقَمَهُ حُوتُ وَهُوَ مُلِيمٌ. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he had agreed to cast lots, and then the big fish swallowed him, and he had done an act of blameworthiness. He had done an act of blameworthiness, meaning that he was sent to the people of Nineveh, and he was sent there to call them to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But because he became frustrated with them, he went away. He left them. And when he came to the ship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of, the storm came, ship became very choppy on the sea, and the captain says, right, we must draw lots. Who is going to be thrown over? So what happened with Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam? The whale swallowed him, as we've spoken about last week. Now Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that the fish in the ocean, they swam past the whale that swallowed up Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam. And the fish wanted to know by the whale, how can you swallow a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Many of us would think the same. It's a messenger, it's a prophet, it's someone who has this great status by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can the whale do such a thing? The whale's response to every creature was, I was ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to swallow him, even though I don't, the thing that I eat, what does whales eat actually? Fish? No. Whales eat plankton. That's one of the smallest microcosms in the sea. That massive whale eats these small plankton. And yet, he says he was ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to swallow Sayyidina Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us of what happened with Nabi Yunus. He sat in the belly of the fish in this darkness. And what was his dua? La ilaha illa anta subhanak inni kuntu min al-zalimin. There is none worthy of worship but you, O Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Glory be unto you. I have indeed been of those who have wronged themselves. So he left it in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then ordered, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, after some time Allah ordered the whale to spit Nabi Yunus out. And those of us who have watched Pinocchio maybe will know it's kind of the very same way. In Disney movies, they follow every one of the stories of the Anbiya alayhi salatu wasalam. Be that as it may, Nabi Yunus was spit out, and having been in the belly of the whale for some time, he was fatigued, so he comes out on shore, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders that there are plants that grow by Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam for him to be able to regain his strength, and thereafter he goes again to call to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but now having learned a very valuable lesson. What was that lesson? Even though people will not respond to you in the very beginning, what is the important thing that the Anbiya has to do? They have to endure the trials of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says in a hadith recorded rather in Sahih Muslim, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says that the person who endures the difficulties of people, the person who endures the abuses of people, the person who endures the people, whatever they may throw at him, but he continues to call them to the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he continues to be in the company of people, and he continues to be someone of righteousness, he is better in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the one who secludes himself and doesn't want to mix with people. And that we learn from Nabi Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam, that even though trials and difficulties we may face, especially in terms of imamat, alimiyya, being of leadership, you will obviously face difficulties, but we have to take it with a pinch of salt and sabr. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we will indeed test you, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ, with something with fear, وَالْجُوعِ, with hunger, نَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ, loss of wealth, وَالْأَنفُسِ, loss of life, وَالثَّمَرَاتِ, and all the things that you've worked for, then you think, I deserve these kinds of things. When you say that, I deserve this, I deserve that, I've worked for it, Allah will test us by it. وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, glad tidings to those who have patience. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells us, in regards to the state of the entirety of humanity, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ, indeed humanity is in a state of loss, is in a state of worry. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, except for those who believe, وَعَمِلُوا صَالِحَاتٍ, وَتَوَاسَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاسَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ, those who persevere on the truth and persevere upon patience, sabr. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us understanding. Ameen. So inshallah, with that said, we move on to the life of two of the Anbiya that One of them is the most mentioned prophet in the glorious Quran. And this is Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. So to understand Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, one has to understand what happened prior to Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. In regards to what the life prior to Nabi Musa was born in Egypt, in what is now today known as Misr in Egypt. Which other prophet did we speak about in terms of Egypt? Nabi Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam. Shukran. Nabi Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam was understood as being the king of Egypt. So how then did we come to a situation where after Nabi Yusuf, this great prosperity, and there was this kingdom and goodness and all of these kinds of things, that after Nabi Yusuf, many generations thereafter, we come to a person who is known as Fir'aun, the Pharaoh. Some of the ulama, they placed Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam approximately 1,000 years after Nabi Yusuf. Allahu a'lam the time span. But after Nabi Yusuf, there comes this person into Egypt, and it is narrated by some of the Israeliyat, some of the Israeli stories, the Hebrew stories, that Fir'aun, was a dark-skinned person. Was a dark-skinned person. Soos ek, right? Don't think I'm Fir'aun, can Allah. But Nabi Yusuf, alayhi salatu wasalam, and the Banu Israel were light-skinned people, were lighter-skinned people, right? You'll find that even if you were to go to that region of Palestine today, people aren't necessarily very dark-skinned. They have lightish skin. So the Banu Israel were light-skinned people. And they were the descendants of Nabi Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam and his brothers. This person, as Fir'aun, known as Fir'aun, his name, his actual name, is lost to history. There is no sahih, there is no authentic, authoritative narration or anything declaring the name of Fir'aun. He's only known in the Quran and the Ahadith as Fir'aun, Pharaoh. So we'll accept him as such. Right. So the understanding goes that Fir'aun came into the city of Egypt and he had some wealth. And what did Fir'aun do? He had high aspirations in trying to be someone of power and influence. So what did he do? Fir'aun used the wealth that he had to buy over the alliances of key individuals in Egypt. What does that now start to do? He starts to amass a certain amount of power among certain people, and he creates fitna amongst the Banu Israel in trying to state that certain of them are better than others. It's a tactic that the Yahud, the Jews, have been using for centuries, known as divide and rule. Right? So Fir'aun goes about, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about this when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Min Fir'auna wa mala'ihi. Fir'aun and his cohort. So Fir'aun used to get certain people to do his bidding. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also speaks about certain others. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about Fir'aun and Haman. Haman, the chief architect of Fir'aun, was one of those whom Fir'aun had a certain influence over him, so he could use him in whatever ways he needed. And in so doing, in doing this kind of divide and conquer tactic, Fir'aun amassed more and more wealth, more and more influence over people, up till the point where he challenged for the leadership of Egypt, and he won because he had the masses behind him. He rallied the masses behind him. Right? However, when Fir'aun now finally came to the level of being the leader of Egypt, then his true colors came about, where now he subjugated the people. The lower classes, he divided them into classes. What we have, very similar to what we have today. Upper class, middle class, and your sub-economic. This was a tactic used even by Fir'aun la'natullah alayh, where he divided people in these categories, these kinds of categories. Right. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about Fir'aun, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, نَتْلُو عَلَيْكَ مِن نَبَأِ مُوسَى وَفِرْعَوْنَ بِالْحَقِّ لِقَوْمِ يُؤْمِنُونَ. We narrate unto you, and this is in Surah Qasas, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we narrate to you part of the story of Musa and Fir'aun in truth, for the people who believe. Inna Fir'auna ala fil ard. Indeed, Fir'aun was very arrogant and very haughty in the land. وَجَعَلَ أَهْلَهَا شِيَعًا يَسْتَضْعِفُونَ طَائِفَةً مِّنْهُمْ يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ إِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He divided the people into groups. And one of those groups, he يُذَبِّحُ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ. He started killing their sons or their children. وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ. And he let their women stay alive. إِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. Indeed, he was one of those who was totally corrupted. وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتُضْعِفُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ الْوَارِثِينَ. And, says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it was our will to favor those who had been oppressed and make them role models in terms of the faith. They are the true successors to the kingdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَنُمَكِّنَ لَهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَنُرِيَ فِرْعَوْنَ وَهَامَانَ وَجُنُودَهُمَا مِنْهُمْ مَا كَانُوا يَحْذَرُونَ. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to establish them in the land, and through them show Fir'aun and Haman and their soldiers that they will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will fulfill that which they had feared. So what did Fir'aun and Haman fear? Fir'aun, having divided people into groups, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Fir'aun had a dream. When you want to divide people and you want to subjugate people, you live in what? You live in fear. Because if you're going to oppress people, you can look at Netanyahu. He lives in fear every single day of his life. They targeted his home even, and he says that he's not worried and all of these things. It's a man who lives in fear. Be that as it may, when you're trying to subjugate people all the time and trying to humiliate people all the time, you live in a state of fear that something's going to happen to you. That even happens with the presidents of the United States. Reagan, they tried to kill. Kennedy, they shot, they assassinated. That for Trump het hulle gemis, apparently. So this is the reality of even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the stories of the Anbiya. That if you're going to live a life wherein you're going to subjugate people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Fir'aun, he was ala fil ard, he was haughty. He thought of himself as being better than others. Whereas if you were to look into the Islamic understanding of governance, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, and I know I'm diverting a little bit, but this is just for our understanding. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, the Ummah of Islam expanded extensively under the rule of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh. When Sayyidina Umar entered into Persia, into modern day Iraq, Lebanon, and these areas, when he conquered these areas, they came to Sayyidina Umar with what we know today as being faluda, strawberry drink. And they said to Sayyidina Umar, this drink used to be drunk by the leaders of these areas. So Sayyidina Umar asked, who else drinks of it? And they said to him, it's only a drink for the elite and for the leaders. Sayyidina Umar says, give it to me. When even the poorest of the poor drink of it, then I'll drink from it. That is how the level of Islam comes about. in terms of governance, in terms of rule of land, in terms of uh, uh, communities, societies, everyone is equal. Communism came to try to bring about that kind of ideology. It didn't work because there was still a kind of ruling party. Islam is the only ideology. Islam is the only set of rules that brings total equality for everyone. Whether you're the ruler of the land or whether you're the street sweeper, everyone is equal. Right? So, Fir'aun, total different story. He had a dream. In his dream, according to the Israeli understanding, is that Fir'aun saw that from Jerusalem, there was a fire that had entered from Jerusalem into Egypt, and it burnt its way all the way into the palace of Pharaoh. But the only homes that were not touched by this fire were the homes of the Banu Israel. He had this dream recurringly over and over and over. He calls his henchmen all together and he tells them, look, this is the dream that I've had. Tell me what does it mean? And they tell Pharaoh that, well, what we can tell you is, if you've been having it over and over, then it's a true dream. And it means that someone from the Banu Israel, from the Israelites, is going to overthrow you. What does Pharaoh now do? He has fear that he's going to be overthrown, so he acts upon this fear. And he says, every second year, kill every male-born baby of the Israelis. Of the Israel, Banu Israel, kill every male baby that is born. Why every second year? Why not every year? The Banu Israel, were the slaves of Egypt. And if you kill all the males, what do? Kill all the slaves, and there's no more slaves. So there's no more workforce. They make use of the slaves to do whatever their bidding is. So he kills them every second year so that one year we have a group of babies that's born so that they're going to be our slaves. Then the next year we kill. Then the year after that, then we have more slaves. And the next year we kill, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So Fir'aun did this every single year. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explicitly says, وَيَسْتَحْيِي نِسَاءَهُمْ, and he let the women live. He killed the children, but he let the women live. What does that do to a mother to see her children being slaughtered? What does it do to a mother? It affects her in ways that can never be understood. Psychologically, some of us may have lost children. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us sabr. Ameen. To have lost a child is a difficulty. But to lose a child to killing, look at what is happening in Gaza today. And tell me about the mothers, what is their cry? How is their lament? How is their sadness? The other tactic, the other reason why Fir'aun let the women stay alive is that if it should be that he is attacked, he would know it cannot come from anyone else other than an Israeli who's trying to take revenge for what he had done. Savage, eh? Tell me this isn't exactly what the Yahud is doing now today in Gaza. Exactly the same. And what do they call it? If you try to attack, then they say it's anti-Semitic, today's terms, right? In the time of Pharaoh had this, that it was a rebellion. You were rebellious. And if you rebel against the leader, it's known as treason. And for the punishment for treason, which still happens, which is still a law in the UK today, if there is an act of treason done in the UK today, it's punishable by what? By death. Till today. So Pharaoh, very cleverly, if the women want to rebel and they want to attack me, we still can kill them because now they've done treason. But now he can say, Fir'aun, he can stand one side and say, well, I didn't kill them. I did nothing to them. They attacked me. Now I killed them. Ah, but that was not how Fir'aun phrases it. It makes him look as if he's the good guy. Anyway, so Fir'aun, he goes about killing these young children, and as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِذْ نَجَّيْنَاكُمْ مِنْ آلِ فِرْعَوْنَ يَسُومُونَكُمْ سُوءَ الْعَذَابِ يُذَبِّحُونَ أَبْنَاءَكُمْ وَيَسْتَحْيُونَ نِسَاءَكُمْ وَفِي ذَلِكُمْ بَلَاءٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ عَظِيمٌ. Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, he reminds the Banu Israel, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam reminds the descendants, the Yahud. Remember, وَإِذْ نَجَّيْنَاكُمْ مِنْ آلِ فِرْعَوْنَ يَسُومُونَكُمْ. Remember when we saved you, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved you from Fir'aun, who yasumunakum, he afflicted you with an intense punishment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here uses the term as Ibn Kathir, he says, yasumunakum, meaning he humiliated you in torture. He first humiliated you in the torture that he committed to you, and then يُذَبِّحُونَ أَبْنَاءَكُمْ. Then he killed your sons. وَيَسْتَحْيُونَ نِسَاءَكُمْ. And then he let your women live. Wallahi al-Azim. Quran is amazing. You see all of this word for word being played out. It's played out in front of our eyes. How the Yahudis do what they are doing to our brothers and sisters in Palestine. They torture them in these prisons. We are sent videos on a daily basis how they bomb areas. There's classified documents from the IDF that have now been brought to light, where the soldiers of the IDF, they actually state, we are addicted to explosions. It doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. We just want to bomb up everything we find. They go into the homes of people and they terrorize children in the middle of the night. For what? Because they, wallahi, just because they can. يَسُومُونَكُمْ سُوءَ الْعَذَابِ. They subjugate them to a humiliating punishment. Why, for what reason? What reason? If we are all sane people here, what reason would there be for a soldier to go into the home of someone, wake up children that are sleeping, separate them from one room to the next, children under the age of 10, and terrorize them with AK-47s and all these massive guns? Terrorize young children. What intellectual argument can there be made for doing something like that? Fir'aun did it in the time of Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. And these Yahud, they are doing exactly the same. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us understanding. Ameen. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted that Nabi Musa, Nabi Harun alayhi salatu wasalam, the older brother of Nabi Musa, he was born in the year that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted that Fir'aun, he didn't want to kill any of the children. So that one year, Harun was born. The year thereafter was the year when the children would be killed. And in that year, Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam was born. So now what must happen? The mother of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, in those years, must also be cognizant of the fact that people didn't know what kind of baby they're going to have until they have given birth. Right. So Nabi Musa's mother gives birth. And she finds it's a son. What's her fear? They're going to kill my baby. So, when a baby is born, what happens with a baby? The baby does what? He cries. When the baby was born, she tied everything. She put the baby immediately in a basket so that the baby's cries cannot be heard. She tried everything so that the baby's cries cannot be heard. But unfortunately, some of the soldiers, they came to look for in the home of the mother of Nabi Musa because they heard something strange, and they started poking with their swords in different parts of the room and in different baskets. And one of the narrations says that when Nabi Musa alayhi salatu salam was still opening his mouth to cry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took away the sound at that moment. However, the tip of one of the swords of the people of Fir'aun had touched and pierced the tongue of Nabi Musa alayhi salatu salam, and that caused that Nabi Musa alayhi salatu salam had spoken with a lisp. Nabi Musa alayhi salatu salam had spoken with a lisp. Right. There's different understandings as to why Nabi Musa had a lisp, and that is not necessarily spoken of in the Quran. This is one of the Israeliyat, one of the stories that is told about Nabi Musa. It's not mentioned in the Quran. So there's no actual significance to it, but Allahu Alam. The mother of Nabi Musa, when these people left, she went to go check because she was certain that, well, he's dead now. They took their sword, they punched it into everything, and she found that Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam was sleeping in this basket. But for his own safety, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had informed the mother of Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam to put him in a basket and let him go onto the river. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of him. So the mother of Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, she does this. She puts him in a basket. She ties the basket up and she puts the basket on the river, and the baby flows in this basket on the river, and she sends Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam's mother, she sends her daughter, her eldest daughter, and some of the Mufassirun, they say that the sister of Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, her name was Maryam. And therefore there's this understanding where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Sayyidatina Maryam alayhi salam, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ukhta Harun. That many of contemporaries, they say that this is in reference to the sister of Nabi Musa and Nabi Harun alayhi salatu wasalam. Her name was Maryam. She followed this basket as it went on the river. Allahu alam. She follows this basket until it comes to the home of Fir'aun. Came to the palace. And who picks up this baby now in this basket? But the wife of Fir'aun. And her name, also told to us through certain ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, her name was Asiya. Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, for an example in the Quran, says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا امْرَأَةَ فِرْعَوْنَ إِذْ قَالَتْ رَبِّ بَلِي عِنْدَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ وَنَجِّنِي مِنْ فِرْعَوْنَ وَعَمَلِهِ وَنَجِّنِي مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and tell them an example of the believers, the wife of Fir'aun, امرأة فرعون. إذ قالت ربي بلي بيتا عندك بيتا في الجنة. She made a dua unto Allah, oh my Lord, build for me a house in paradise near you. وَنَجِّنِي مِنْ فِرْعَوْنَ وَعَمَلِهِ, and save me from Fir'aun and all the destruction that he does. وَنَجِّنِي مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ, and save me from the wrongdoing people. Now I'm just going to take a few minutes to look at Sayyidatina Asiya. Sayyidatina Asiya, she was the wife of Fir'aun, meaning that she was used to the luxury, and she was used to the palace, she was used to the high life. She fell in love with this baby, Nabi Musa alayhi salatu salam. She was a woman who was barren. She couldn't have children of her own. So when this baby, Musa alayhi salatu salam, comes to the palace on the river, she says, maybe this is a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this baby, I must look after this baby. It's been delivered to me on the river, here to the palace, so maybe I must take care of this baby. She takes the baby. Fir'aun hears the baby crying in the palace, and he runs and he wants to kill the baby because he sees that, hey, this isn't one of our babies, this isn't one of us. He must be killed. What does she say? Qurratu ayni walak. He makes me happy. And he's going to make you also happy. Sometimes we have this very soft spot for our women. So she says to Fir'aun, maybe she batted the eyelids a bit or whatever, swing the hair so about. And she tells Fir'aun, look, this baby makes me happy. Okay, babes, whatever makes you happy. You know, that kind of thing with Fir'aun. So he lets her keep this baby. But Fir'aun doesn't understand that this same baby that he's now raising will eventually cause his own destruction. Sayyidatina Asiya, she loved Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam. So when Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam preaches the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is one of the first people that's receptive to Nabi Musa? Is Sayyidatina Asiya. She believes in him immediately. Why? She had raised him. She knows who he is. If he's coming with this kind of news, she knows that this has to be the truth. She knows the kind of person that she's raised. Mothers know alles. I'm certain there's so many of us. We don't have our mothers. May Allah grant them Jannatul Firdaus. Ameen. Those of us who still have our mothers, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them longevity and khairat and barakat. Ameen. Our mothers know us better than what we know ourselves. That's the truth. Sayyidatina Asiya was this mother to Nabi Musa alayhi salatu. And she was a woman of true iman. So when she believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Fir'aun became furious with her. And to humiliate her, Fir'aun did a few things. Fir'aun first of all shaved off all her hair. And then he undressed her and put on rags for her. Raggedy clothes. And he paraded her through the streets of Egypt. She was the queen, right? The wife of Fir'aun, she was the queen, used to the high life. And now he dresses her up as a peasant, shaved head, in the heat of Egypt. He lets her walk behind a chariot carried by horses, pulled by horses. And she has to walk like this through the streets of Egypt. So Firaun wants to know by her, do you denounce this belief in Musa and his one God? And she says, no, she still believes in Allah. So what does Firaun do next? He says to Haman and his henchmen, his soldiers, he says, take her to the deepest part of the desert and you tie her down by knocking nails into her hands and into her feet. Like what they did with Nabi Isa alayhi salatu wasalam. They did that with Sayyidatina Asiya. They pinned her into the ground, into the sand. And as we know, the heat of the sand in Arabia, very, 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 very hot. And on this burning sand, she laid. And some of the narration says that Sayyidatina Asiya, when she was laying in the heat of the sand, she made dua unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this was the dua that she made. Rabbi bali indaka baytan fil jannah. Oh Allah, build me a house near you in Jannah. And this is what the dua that she kept making. She kept making this dua. And every time they came to ask her, do you denounce Musa and this one belief? And she said, no, she still believes in Allah. And the henchmen go back to Firaun. They say to Firaun, she doesn't want to stop believing. So Firaun says to the mouth, Firaun says to the henchman, okay, you go ask her one last time. But if she doesn't say that she believes in me as being the Lord Most High, then you take a rock and you throw a rock over her. And you kill her, you crush her. So what's the dua she's making? Rabbi bali indaka baytan fil jannah. So she makes this dua. And when they ask her a last time, do you denounce Musa? And she says, no, I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they take the rock and the final dua is, Rabbi bali baytan indaka fil jannah. Oh Allah, build me a house close to you in Jannah. وَنَجِّنِي مِنْ فِرْعَوْنَ وَعَمَلِهِ وَنَجِّنِي مِنْ قَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. And save me from the actions of Fir'aun. What was the actions? Fir'aun instructed that she be killed by them throwing this rock on her. So in the tafsir of Imam Al-Qurtubi, as well as Ibn Kathir, they say that just before they threw the rock on the body of Sayyidatina Asiya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted that she passed away. So when she did not have to feel the weight of having this rock being thrown upon her. But she died in a state of Iman, appealing unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Conviction in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Says our beloved Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in regards to Sayyidatina Asiya. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, it's recorded in Sahih Bukhari, that there are many men that have reached the status of wilaya, friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they awliya. But there are only few women who have reached that status. Of the few women that have reached that status, says Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is Sayyidatina Maryam, the daughter of Imran, and Asiya Tumra'atu Fir'aun. Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun. In another hadith reported in Sahih Bukhari, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as narrated by Abdullah ibn Abbas, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he drew 4 lines in the sand one day. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked the Sahaba, Atadruna ma hadha? Do you know what are these 4 lines? And the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum, the Sahaba, they said to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allahu wa Rasulu a'lam. Allah and His messengers, He knows best. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, Afdalun nisa'i ahlil jannah. These 4 lines represent the best of all women, the best women in the Jannah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, they are Khadija bint Khuwaylid, Khadija bint Khuwaylid, the wife of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Sayyidatina Khadija al-Kubra, wa Fatima bint Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wa Maryamu ibnatu Imran, and Sayyidatina Maryam, the daughter of Imran, wa Asiyatu ibnatu Muzahim, imra'atul Fir'aun. And the last one is Asiya, Sayyidatina Asiya bint Muzahim, the wife of Fir'aun. So this woman, Sayyidatina Asiya, she was a woman of Jannah. She was a very, very good woman who lived and died for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأُوحَيْنَا إِلَىٰ أُمِّ مُوسَىٰ أَنْ أَرْضِئِهِ فَإِذَا خِفْتِ عَلَيْهِ فَأَلْقِيهِ فِي الْيَمِّ وَلَا تَخَافِي وَلَا تَحْزَنِي إِنَّا رَادُّهُ إِلَيْكِ وَجَائِلُوهُ مِنَ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we inspired the mother of Nabi Musa. An ardi'i, nurse him, meaning give him breastfeed him, and then put him in this basket so that he may go on the river. فَإِذَا حِفْتِ عَلَيْهِ, and if you fear for him, فَأَلْقِيهِ فِي الْيَمِّ, put him in a basket on the river. وَلَا تَخَافِي وَلَا تَحْزَنِي, and don't fear and don't grieve for him. إِنَّا رَادُّهُ إِلَيْكِ, we will indeed return him unto you. وَجَائِلُهُ مِنَ الْمُرْسَلِينَ, and we are going to make him of the messengers. فَالْتَقَطَّعُهُ آلُ فِرْعَوْنَ لِيَكُونَ لَهُمْ عَدُوًّا وَحَزَانًا. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it so happened that Fir'aun's people picked him up, only to become the enemy and a source of grief. Meaning, when they picked him up, did they know that this baby is going to be the downfall of Fir'aun? They didn't know that. In the same way that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, astaghfirullah, with the ulama of tafsir, they say that you never know where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant that the izzah, the strength of Islam lies. So it could be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is letting the people of Palestine and Gaza suffer. But it might be a catalyst that somehow the Muslim Ummah stands up once again and is a superpower. In whose hands is that? Only in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't know. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Nabi Musa's mother, put him on the on the river, and if you fear for him, don't worry, we're going to bring him back to you. So how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring back Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam to his mother? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Fir'aun and Sayyidatna Asiya, وَقَالَتِ امْرَأَةُ فِرْعَوْنَ قُرَّةُ عَيْنِي لِي وَلَكَ لَا تَقْتُلُوهُ عَسَىٰ أَن يَنْفَعَنَا أَوْ نَتَّخِذَهُ وَلَدًا وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, she said to Fir'aun, don't kill him. He makes me happy. He's going to make you happy as well. Maybe he can benefit us. We can take him as our son, as our baby. And they didn't understand that what is going to lie forth for Fir'aun. وَأَصْبَحَ فُؤَادُ أُمِّ مُوسَى فَارِغًا. Says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the heart of the mother of Musa started to ache. She wanted to see her baby. إِنْ كَادَتْ لَتُبْدِي بِهِ لولا أن ربطنا على قلبها لتكون من المؤمنين. It ached so much that she had to give away his identity. She didn't let him be known as one of the Israeliyat, of those who are of the Banu Israel. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted the opportunity to arise where Allah fulfills his promise to her. The promise is that she will be returned unto Musa. The daughter of Nabi, or rather the sister of Nabi Musa, had to go see where this basket goes. She comes back to her mother and she says that the basket with the baby has eventually ended up by the palace of Fir'aun. And now, what does a baby do after some time? He cries. And if a baby cries, then it's one of three things. Hy vaak, honger, of hy spyl. So they checked Nabi Musa. He's not dirty. He's not tired. Then he must be hungry. And so the wife of Fir'aun, she calls all the ladies in the palace to now breastfeed this baby. But he doesn't want to take on anyone. So Fir'aun sends out news into the city of Egypt, and he says to everyone in Egypt, there's a baby at the palace that is in need of someone to breastfeed. Whoever comes, we will reward that person very handsomely. So people come, and they're lining up by Pharaoh's door. No one is able to satisfy the screaming baby until the mother of Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam comes in, and he's immediately calmed and he drinks from his mother. So now Fir'aun is not only raising the one who will overthrow him, but he's paying the family of Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam to sustain him so that eventually he can overthrow him. And the mother of Nabi Musa has free access into the palace of Fir'aun as much as she wants. Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not the best of planners? Subhanallah. You can't make these things up. Subhanallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala once again shows us how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings fulfillment to the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at that point, we'll stop, inshallah. We'll carry on as to what happened after Nabi Musa alayhi salatu wasalam was now grown into a strong man. Inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all tawfiq and hidayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us to understand the stories of the Anbiya alayhi salatu wasalam. And more importantly, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us that we take to heart what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is communicating to us by virtue of these stories. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also grant our brothers and sisters in Palestine, in Gaza, in Lebanon, who is undergoing such great difficulty. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them victory. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them sabr. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant that those forces that seek to destroy them, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroy those forces instead. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant that Islam once again is victorious over all those who try to subjugate Islam, inshallah. With that, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all that our lives be filled with khairat and barakat. And that the last words on our lips be the kalima of La ilaha illallah محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم ووفقنا إلى الحق وإلى طريق مستقيم. بركة القرآن يا أرحم الراحمين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.